At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, Neill. And today, everybody, we have a real treat for you. We have two very, very special guests. We have Dr. James Morgan and Professor Chris Chandler. And together, the three of us, we are Street Drugs Discussions. So today, Street Drugs Discussions meets drug science. So this is a rare opportunity to find out a bit more about Street Drugs Discussions, to find out about the people behind it, and to really meet the people, everybody. So what is Street Drugs Discussions then? If you don't already know, it's a series of now webinars about all aspects of drugs, legal and illegal. Now, looking back actually to when we started the webinars, which was during the pandemic 2020, we've now hosted 26 webinars on topics, really wide-ranging topics, from steroids to chemsex, after parties, nitrous oxide, cannabis, alcohol, trafficking and policing, ketamine, which has been one of our most popular webinars. They're all free and you can join them all using the Drug Science website. Now we are in collaboration with Drug Science, of course, and they host them on their website. So it's possible to get access to the recording from all the webinars that we've ever done. ADHD and substance use is our 27th webinar, and that's proving to be extremely popular. We've also hosted and been involved with live events, including our most recent at London Metropolitan University, Heroin Trends and Treatments. And James and Chris are going to tell us more about that in a little while. I thought I'd explain how it all started, actually. So for me, I've worked in drug discovery and psychiatry all my career, which is 40 years. It's a bit scary to look back on all this stuff. And I suppose came to a position where all the drugs were very early stage drug discovery. None of the innovative drugs that we've worked on have got onto the market, got into patients, and actually made a difference. So I was looking for something better, and which is how I came to work on psychedelic assisted therapy. But it all started for me. I was driving home one night from work with Radio 4 on, and Neill Woods was being interviewed by Eddie Mayer. Now, Neill Woods is a former undercover police officer, and his job was to infiltrate organized crime, gangs dealing drugs. And his job was to get to the top of the chain and to ensure that the top guys were arrested and to kind of bust the whole operation. And he was very, very good at this. He did this for a number of years, and he put a lot of very top organized crime people into prison as a result of his work. And he came to the realization that actually his actions and the actions of the police force were doing an awful lot more harm than good, and that their work putting people behind bars had never interrupted the drug supply by more than 2 hours. And actually what it had done was make the kind of organized crime a lot more paranoid and a lot more violent. He said the whole situation has become weaponized, and he believes that it was partly the sort of these operations by the police force that had led to that happening. So his trauma comes obviously from a lot of the danger that he was under, but from having spent so much time doing a job that has caused an awful lot more harm than good. And also the people who got swept up in the drug busts, the people who are vulnerable, dealing drugs to support their own drug use, people who are very, very, very vulnerable members of society. So he gave all this up and he joined LEAP, which at that time was Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, but is now Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And they're campaigning to reform our drug laws and for state regulation, actually, of all drugs. So it's a very, very interesting perspective and very important perspective. And in fact, Neill Woods has been on the Drug Science podcast, and I highly advise that you listen to that. So that kind of was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. And I thought, well, this is something that I have to work on then, to do what I can to change the drug laws, because it's the drug laws that are doing so much harm to people. So I contact David Nutt, of course, who's in charge of drug science, who we all know so well, and joined drug science. And kind of for me, the rest has been history. But I kind of at the time, I thought, well, what can an academic do to change things? And I thought, well, we are educators. That's what we do. So what I will do is organize a symposium and get as many people in as I can, general public, people who are working in this area, police, academics. So, and we called this Street Drugs in the Northern Powerhouse, and we held this in March 2018. And we had a number of very high profile experts working in harm reduction, working in drug policy, working on the streets with people who use drugs to help keep people safe. So we had Neill Woods, we had Professor Fiona Measham of the Loop, we had Professor David Nutt, we had Professor Val Curran, and we had Andy Costello from Greater Manchester Police. It was a real success. And all those people have been on the street drugs webinars, apart from Andy Costello. He's too busy working for Greater Manchester Police. So it was a real eye-opener for me. I learned an awful lot at that event, and meeting the people who are really involved in reforming our drug laws and keeping people safe and harm reduction was a complete privilege. The university asked me to get some feedback on the event, so I contacted people who had attended, and James Morgan had been there. He gave me a lot of really good, helpful feedback. So I suggested that he hosted the next event, and we start a street drugs series. And that really is the start of street drugs discussions. That's how it came about. And, James and Chris did this, and we've been doing it together ever since. So I want to stop talking, and I'd like to then introduce you to James and to Chris. And I think what I'd like to do, they'll tell you the tale about the event that James and Chris organised and hosted in London. But what I'd like you to hear about is from them what they do, because they are experts in drug policy, harm reduction, drug dealing from a research perspective and harm reduction. So I think if we start with James, and you can tell us all about what you do.
Hi, Joe. Many thanks for all of that, and very nice to remember the beginnings of your Manchester event. And I'll say a little bit later about how that pivoted onto our London event and then all the subsequent stuff that we've done. Currently myself, I'm Senior Lecturer of Psychology at London Metropolitan University, but I'll go a little bit further back to, I guess, how I got involved in researching various things about substance use. So going all the way back, I initially did study psychology with sociology, and then got a particular interest in crime and deviance. I think there's a second year sociology of deviance module that kind of first got me hooked. I think that I did a study abroad term, which offered me 2 modules about crime. I think I decided it was then it was crime that I was kind of mostly interested in. Then I did a master's in criminology as well. After finishing my master's, I kind of experimented with having normal jobs in offices for a year or 2. And so basically decided I needed to get back to university and research something. And then in the end, I contacted Professor Trevor Bennett, a criminologist at the University of South Wales. I got the train to Pontypridd, had a meeting with him and Professor Katie Holloway, And then 2 hours later, I kind of walked out with a research question, which was something at the time, what maintains long-term careers in heroin or something like that. And then for the next 7 years, that was my PhD, which of course ended up answering a different question. I'm using different methods to what I'd expected. But anyway, I began then to research substance use. And so during that research program, I was based in South Wales. I was volunteering at Tier 3, what was known as a Tier 3 service, essentially provided needle exchange, drop-in, and also referrals to more structured services. And through that, interviewed 51 people who used heroin.
James, is there a reason that you wanted to focus on heroin?
Very good question. Funnily enough, I'll tell you about some of my more recent research. But yeah, last week I was doing more research and one of my participants asked me just that and was somewhat baffled. Someone who used heroin himself was really quite baffled that I had decided to take such an interest in it. And I would say reason being though, at least in, it was 2010 when I started my PhD, so it's probably 2009 when I started scoping for topics of interest. And I guess heroin, it's always had quite a lot of bad press. I think I first knew about heroin when I watched the film Trainspotting, which, of course shows it. It's an absolutely incredible film. So when you get a particular picture of heroin use from there, it has a particular, there is some sort of stigma attached to many forms of psychoactive substance use, but arguably heroin has received the worst press of all. But I would say that whereas socially many forms of substance use were in front of me or at close quarters, and there's in some way could get some vicarious experience to generate some understanding of them, heroin was not so close by. And so I think my potential supervisors at the time asked me a similar question. And I think I would have said to them, it's got a bad press. I'd like to understand more about it. So I think I talked about heroin, focusing on heroin and crack. I believe my supervisors thought it would be more parsimonious to focus on one substance. And as I said, we kind of spent 2 hours workshopping research question. If you'd ever met Professor Trevor Bennett and tried to workshop something of him, he's a brilliant, incredible thinker, published extensively on, as a criminologist, many substance use issues through the lens of criminology, but he workshops ideas through drawing diagrams to represent the theoretical relations of the concepts you'll be trying to investigate. So through lots of scrawling on papers and quite intensive talking about drug use, about existing research and about whatever gap in the market I was hoping to plug, I anyway left that room with a research question, which would kind of start a research agenda, which is still on running 15 years since that meeting.
That's really impressive, isn't it, that he was able to shape all your thoughts into a research question?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, at the time at the University of South Wales, which back then was the University of Glamorgan, there were 2 other PhD students looking at other aspects of heroin use and kind of looking at how I would fit in with their projects, kind of working, researching in tandem, I guess. We came up with something. And then, as I said, I was volunteering locally in the area. And through that, I managed to recruit 51 people to interview. Mostly I would be sitting in a needle exchange when a service user came in, coming in to get injecting equipment. The sort of syringes and needles they asked for would reveal what substance they were using. And if their request suggested heroin use, then I would say, I'm conducting this study at the moment. In exchange for a £10 Tesco voucher, would you like to talk to me about your drug use for some time between 1 and 2 hours? With inflation, we actually now more often give £20 Tesco vouchers. That's what we were doing at the most recent study. I conducted 51 interviews on that basis, mainly looking at the lifestyles of people who use heroin. I won't bore you with the ups and downs of my PhD, but long story short, it took 7 years and eventually my revisions were accepted and eventually got my PhD.
But James, 51 deep interviews is an awful lot.
It is. I'm not entirely sure why I aimed so high in terms of a sample size, and certainly as a mainly qualitative researcher, I could have got away with fewer. I would say, though, because I was looking at many aspects of variation, both within people's heroin using careers, so that is, once someone started using heroin, their life can change and take many different shapes.
James, do you have many women?
So that was a weakness of the study. Of the 51, 9 of that study were women. And we've speculated as to why that would be. In lots of substance use research, recruiting from harm reduction or treatment venues, you can expect a 4-to-1 ratio. Many researchers think that suggest that the ratio is the difference in using populations between men and women is not that great. And I think there's aspects of the recruitment procedure. The fact that I am a man would understandably mean that perhaps some women would have been more comfortable telling their story to another woman. I was a research team of 1, so understandably some women more women might have turned down the opportunity to research. In fact, I'd also add as well, an extra weakness of that study is it was a very white sample as well. And I wonder if me being a white man also meant that people who are not white might have been less comfortable in sharing their stories with me also. 51 overall, 42 men, 9 women. I can't remember the exact ethnic breakdown, but it was a very, very largely white sample. So yeah, conducted those interviews, eventually got the PhD done and have continued with the heroin-related research. I followed up with a more specific look at the lifestyles of people who both used and sold heroin. It was one unexpected finding of the first study that quite a large number of my initial sample sold drugs at the same time as using heroin. It's fairly established in literature that a lot of people who use heroin might fund their daily use by buying kind of medium amounts. They might spend, say, £60 and then break it down to smaller units, sell £60 worth and consume the rest themselves. But one surprising finding was hearing stories of people who actually made quite a lot of money selling drugs while using them. The drug use wouldn't always help business. It was a fairly familiar narrative of chaos brought around by excessive use of especially heroin and especially crack cocaine, negatively impacting the business. But anyways, a few people managed quite well. So that was a follow-up study, returning to South Wales, actually visiting a different drug service at this point, and specifically asking drugs workers to find me service users who sold as well as used drugs. So I think I did another 16 or so interviews based on that more specific sample. Since then, and then more recently, in fact, so I think that's 2017, 2018. I mean, since then, I'm still writing up journal articles based on the original PhD data. I think it's another bonus or upside or downside with the large number of interviews I did first off was I keep on finding more stuff to write about, but have eventually gone back into the field. We've got 2 projects ongoing at the moment. One is called Heroin, Health and Lifestyle. That's with one of my PhD supervisors, Professor Katie Holloway, who is a definite friend of the Street Drugs Discussions programme. Also with Marianne Booker-Choi and another colleague at South Wales, and Aled Davis, a medical practitioner based at Cardiff University. So we're continuing the focus, lifestyle and heroin use, but also looking at health problems faced, health-seeking behaviours, trying to really look at if there's any way that healthcare can be changed to be more suitable for people who use drugs. And finally, before I pass over, there's another research project actually in collaboration with Professor Chris Chandler. We are looking at a scheme of diamorphine-assisted treatment, but more specifically looking at an aspect of it to essentially gauge. So diamorphine-assisted treatment, I'll say a little bit more, is essentially prescribing clinical grade heroin to people who use heroin as part of their treatment program. And one difficulty faced in that is essentially to get the correct dosing. While in this scheme, the heroin is essentially measured out by practitioners and then given to the patient to inject themselves, it's still obviously critical that while sufficient diamorphine is administered so that the patient does not seek street drugs, it obviously can't be so much as to cause an overdose. And Professor Adam Winstock has generated a particular method for deciding on the correct dose, which is referred to by the acronym DEAL. And DEAL essentially assesses from 1 to 7 how much the dose of diamorphine has affected the patient. And we have been interviewing patients on that scheme and clinicians about the good working of it. I've said I've also spoken for too long, as is my tendency. So now I'll pass over to you, Chris, to introduce yourself, and you might as well want to say a little bit more about the DEAL evaluation.
I just, before you finish, James, do you think there's any reduction in the stigma around heroin use in all the time you've been working with heroin users?
That's a very, very good question. So firstly, I would say this isn't something that is directly discovered through my own research. So what I'll be kind of giving is more of, I guess, the in view of someone who's largely interested. I would say no. I think it's still got a very bad reputation. I would say that whether or not it is grabbing all of the headlines that it used to, I would consider it still be at the top level of most stigmatized drugs. From what I've seen, it still carries the stigma it always has. You could speculate that if use of the drug reduces and as do associated problems, then perhaps the stigma might reduce as its previous constructions might be forgotten about. But no, I don't see much evidence of any destigmatization of heroin use.
So we've still some work to do there. Yeah, so on to you then, Chris. Tell us all about your career.
Well, it's not as colourful as James's. I spent most of mine in a laboratory with a white coat on, doing things. I suppose my career in this started a lot longer ago, back in the late 80s, where I was working on dopamine receptors, which obviously have a great bearing in the addiction story. I did my PhD in that, and it was on dopamine D1 and D2 receptors, which there were only 2 back in those days. And now, wow, there's so many more. So many more.
Chris, when I started, there were 7 5-HT, no, maybe 3 5-HT receptors. I don't know. Yes, it's amazing how
it's mind-boggling now. And from there, I went to, I worked directly then in addiction with nicotine, but also a little bit of cocaine and morphine and amphetamines at the Institute of Psychiatry, as it was back in those days, but now Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, which is part of King's College. And there I worked on as I say, nicotine, and spent a fair amount of time devising models to assess dependence, things like drug discrimination and the kind of learning theory behind addiction. I did that for a few years, and then I ended up at, well, it was London Guildhall, but it then merged into what is now London Metropolitan University, where James is also at now. And I've been there, it's over 25 years.
It's funny how you find that, oh my goodness, you've been there for over 20 years.
Stuff happens, doesn't it? And yeah, I worked in similar sort of areas for a little while in the kind of preclinical world, in which I was looking at MDMA and sensitization, the increased responsiveness from drugs, rather than what people know about, which is tolerance, looking at the kind of the flip of that. But needs be, policies changed, and I started looking at the neuropsychology behind substance use and addiction. And, to use my the phrase that I trot out in front of my students with alarming frequency, looking at the triumph of motivation over reason, really, and how the world, perhaps a very narrow world, conspires to keep people taking the drugs, even when they want to stop doing it. So I've looked at neuropsychological mechanisms that steer people's behaviour, like attention being diverted, impulse control. And we've looked at a number of those sort of aspects. We've also looked at that with regard to genetics, again with the IOP back in the day.
And this is in a clinical population?
In clinical populations now, yeah. Primarily was with alcoholics at the time. But we also look at non-clinical but using populations. And we've looked at, nicotine, smoking, alcohol, MDMA. And more recently, I'm looking at the interaction between neuropsychological mechanisms like attention, steering, impulse control, and not being able to stop yourself. And also more recently, starting with my new PhD student, Beata, is looking at hormone regulation in females and how neuropsychological mechanisms may well be primed to make cessation or wanting of drugs a little bit stronger during particular points in the ovulatory cycle.
Oh, how interesting.
It is.
How did that project come about? That's very interesting.
I don't really want to say. It came about, well, I suppose that one of the joys of working at somewhere like London Met and teaching a wider curriculum is you end up reading about things that you perhaps wouldn't otherwise encounter. And I realised that actual hormone fluctuations were quite related to dopamine. So that's where I come from. Everything sort of, all roads lead to dopamine for me, I suppose. And that actually, we know that people have difficulty in stopping. Women seem to be, as a particular demographic, were not really particularly looked at that much, mainly with smoking, it has to be said. And I kind of felt, well, actually, what we need to do is unpack the box there and see whether there are, the brain is more attuned, more sensitive at particular times during the cycle that will make this behaviour a harder thing to manage. But also, the stress, etc., particularly with things like premenstrual dysphoria, having an impact there. So there's it comes from that angle, having read around to teach students other things that actually I can bring these together. And that's been, like I say, that's one of the joys of having a job where you don't just always teach the one narrow thing that you do.
Fascinating, Chris. And as a woman of a certain age, I'm wondering about the menopause.
Well, indeed. And that will be where we go next, I'm going to suggest. I think we'll try and get our baseline understanding with premenopausal women, but then that is definitely, and also looking at people on hormonal contraception.
Oh yeah,
to see how that is influencing it. So that's where, and I've been really lucky to have a number of PhD students over the years that have really steered a lot of this. So I think that's been, Joe, Anita, Sharon, who's also done one of the.
Oh, Sharon Cox was one of your PhD students, and we've had her on the.
And Lynn, who we work with on MDMA. So I've been really lucky, and I've got a couple of new ones, Eduardo and Beata, that are working on the ones I told you about. And also they culminated in writing a book, a small, short book on addiction, called Addiction, a Biopsychosocial Perspective, with Anita Andrews.
Chris, I love that book. I've used it for my lectures. It's great.
Oh, thank you, Joe. That contributes to my royalties. And I met James. I was head of department for a while. I think I've dragged you back from Singapore. Yeah, so we were able to do things together, and it's been really good because James has a very different perspective to me. I'm a bit more bio, a bit more lab, and James brings in the reality of it all, which is really helpful.
So you are the dream team.
I wouldn't necessarily call it a dream.
The A-team.
Yeah, something
But
like
I
that.
think in collaborations, you want to work with people who've got different skill sets. It works best.
Yeah, and I think this is where working on the deal, we bring certain things, to it that might be slightly different. But James is a powerhouse of work,
Yes, indeed
I
he
have
is.
to say.
I'm very good at sending an email and suggesting we'll start a new thing. So
Yeah,
I'm very good at creating work for myself and others by having ideas and starting things. Must continue actually finishing them, but yeah.
I think we all suffer from that, James.
Well, I think you make a very good point about PhD students driving their own projects and coming up with some brilliant ideas. And, clearly, James, you did that as part of your PhD. This was essentially your idea, but you needed to shape it. And Trevor helped you do that. And I guess, Chris, that happens to us with our PhD students.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, without them, I think everything becomes so much more difficult.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And what I love as well is watching the career progression of your PhD students and where they go and how well they do. It's fantastic. Okay, so James, should we go back to you and tell us a little bit then back to street drugs and how that event in London, because that event in London was absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, so thank you, Joe, and thank you, Chris, for that rundown there. So I don't think we'd ever met or had been even really aware of each other's existence, Joe, until I saw your street drugs in the Big Smoke Manchester event advertised. I think you reeled off some of the names of the speakers you had, who were kind of people I had always admired. So I decided I wished to attend. Presumably, hopefully, I found some funding at my own institution. So I got the train up to Manchester and I attended and had a really excellent day. Lots and lots of people there. I don't think we met, but you did afterwards email me. I think possibly you just kind of looked down the list of attenders, noticed my academic email address, and you'd asked me if I could write a little report or review of the event, which I did. And then you suggested we do another similar event in London. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm always ever the optimist of starting new projects and dragging other suckers in to work on these projects with me. So at that point, I believe the year was 2018, I think, and I was still a criminology lecturer back then. So I'd only had limited dealings with you by then, Chris, but I was aware that you were an addiction psychologist. And at least at the time, it didn't seem like there were many other substance-related researchers at London Met Uni.
No, I don't think there was then. That was in our lean time, wasn't it? So we were skeleton staff by that point in time. And now we built up again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. But anyway, that I think I identified you, Chris, as a good collaborator for this. So roped you in to join. I think as well, Devinder Curry, who was head of criminology at the time, I think he worked with us on that one. And we put our heads together. We managed to win some internal funding. And we really dreamt up something of a wish list of some of the speakers and important voices in the substance misuse world. And I believe for that one, Professor David Nutt spoke. Also, I believe Neill Woods spoke at that event as well. We had a full day of 7 or 8 or 9 speakers, I think. Also, at the time, we had a student who is now a colleague called Mariela Alvarez, and she produced a very impressive undergraduate dissertation where she sought to understand the process of legalizing cannabis in Uruguay.
James, I think our listeners would really like to hear about us going to the House of Commons.
Yes, indeed. Was it even House of Lords? One of the two. But yes, because we had 2 people involved in international drug policy, 2 people who had been involved in some pretty groundbreaking liberalizations of drug policy. And I think then, Joe, you and your contacts spoke to some people related to a particular cross-parliamentary drug policy group.
So it was the all-party parliamentary group on drug law reform that Jeff Smith MP chaired.
Yeah, indeed. And so I think through yourself and Jeff, Joe, we were then Marcos and Nuno were invited along to present to current sitting politicians, part of this group, on their experiences changing policy in their own countries. I think, Joe, myself and you were invited along as well. So we turned up with Nuno and Marcos. And then, essentially, someone knocking on a door, bringing us in, and seeing politicians, some of whom I recognised, sitting there. I think we were then brought in to sit on, there was a bench at the back which had space. And then I believe a couple of politicians left, and Caroline Lucas.
Well, I was going to mention Caroline Lucas because you were very pleased to be sitting beside her.
Sort of, yeah. She'd always been a bit of a hero of mine. Big fan of Caroline's, and I had and Caroline invited me to sit next to her. It was a very interesting event and very nerve-wracking to sit shoulder to shoulder to kind of with members of Parliament who you recognised and admired. Anyway, hugely interesting, and I guess it made the event feel even more worthwhile that there was clear political reach with that. You'll notice we haven't really, in those 6 years since, we haven't had the massive liberalisation we'd hoped for, but I'm sure, and I hope that the politicians present had listened, and at some point some of the lessons told by Marcos and Nuno might affect real change in our own politics.
I hope so. It's about time, James. It really is.
Going back to when we did the one in London before in 2018, I always think one of the most memorable parts was when we had the guy with lived experience talking. And that was towards the end of the day, and it kind of really brought home what everybody was talking about. And it also reminds me that the audience that we are talking to is so wide and varied that it really does have quite a lot of reach. And it generates such interesting questions and points of view that have continued, and you see it in the webinars. But yeah, going online was interesting, wasn't it? I mean, we were all a bit green about the technology back then. We were jumping from platform to platform. I can't even remember what platform we used in the end. It was Zoom, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah. Zoom sort of took off in the pandemic.
Yeah. And it was, people was getting broadbands and getting their connections, and all of those things seemed to be much more of a problem back then. But we seem to have got it quite well oiled now. So we have as James has said, we have these wonderful speakers from many different areas and different approaches to the same topic, and it makes it interesting for us all. It makes
You're right, Chris.
It's appealing to a wide group of people.
And I think we tried hard to keep it a discussion, to make sure there's loads of room for people to ask their questions and to be part of the conversation, really.
And of course, there was that very first one that we did where everybody had their cameras on, and the guy decided to go to the toilet with his computer, and we had to turn it off the feed off very, very quickly. That sticks in my mind.
Well, you live and learn, don't you? It's quite a steep learning curve. Yeah. So it's really interesting to think of how it's evolved, because I don't think anybody really knew how to run an online event. I guess some people did, but we certainly didn't. So we were learning as we went along, really, learning through our own mistakes.
Yeah. I think also joining up with Drug Science has been great, hasn't it? Because it's getting the information out there, that we're actually doing this out there. Whereas that was one of the harder, is publicising. And James is very good at that because he does social media.
Yes, he does social media.
I do far too much social media. It's a bad habit. But yeah, it is also, there's certainly a commute on X, formerly known as Twitter, which I think rapidly declining as a platform, but there's always been a great community of researchers on that. And of course, you never exactly know when the room fills up on a webinar, how people heard about it, where it's from. But there's always been a great community there. And you can kind of, once you start publicising there and the likes and retweets take off, you kind of get the feeling that this might be a popular one.
I think, was ketamine our most popular ever? Did we have over 500 sign-ups?
Possibly. I believe very early on, one of the ones about policing or policy, I believe may have trumped it. I think ketamine was right up there, if not the most popular. In fact, at the time of recording, we are something like 2 days in advance of the webinar about ADHD relating to substance use, and I think that might even trump it. So that will be an event that had happened and is available to you on YouTube by the time you listen to us now. But we are currently rubbing our hands with nervous excitement about what might be our most popular yet, since I think about 2 weeks ago, we'd hit 400 sign-ups for that one. And it's growing and growing and growing.
It is
No pressure there.
Yeah, no pressure at all. But yes, it is extraordinary how quickly some of them do fill up. And of course, loads of advantages to having an online platform to do this on. We can have international speakers, and we've done that many times. I remember the safe injection facility person from Germany. Off the top of my head, I can't remember all the international people we've had, but we have had quite a lot of people. And then there's no limit to how many people can join either, I don't think. Maybe with Zoom there is, but we haven't reached it yet. So it's all good. We are talking about a book. Is it safe to mention that on the podcast? Because we haven't got anything sort of definite yet. But we would really like to publish a book with chapters from all the people who've done different webinars.
Yeah, just say a little bit more. So I think at the point we first had this idea, we spoke to many of the people who had appeared on our probably first 10 or 15 webinars and proposed a book which would cover lots of the key issues which have been discussed in the street drugs discussions, webinars and symposiums. But yeah, we are still at the stage of finding a publisher to agree to it. We think we've got a good idea for this, but we need to essentially provide a publisher with a little bit more before we can get going. That I'm hoping there will be a positive announcement soon about progress with that one.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the last live event that was in London, the heroin event?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit more about that one. So as someone whose primary research has been heroin, I like the idea of basing another symposium around heroin use. This was as well, I would say, slightly less ambitious than our first event for a few reasons. One is we kept it to an afternoon only rather than all day, which is getting into some of the boring nuts and bolts of event organisation. When something starts in the morning, you pay people peak train fares and you often pay for their hotel, whereas for an afternoon only, you can avoid such costs. And with that, you avoid essentially having to go through and make the bookings and change the bookings and cancel the bookings if people's plans change. So that was less onerous. Also, largely, I would say, due to some budgetary constraints, we focused on more local speakers. Weren't able for this one to fund people flying in from great distances to speak. But yeah, we had a really, really enjoyable day. So I think the day where things surpassed our expectations and actually going very well once the our audience and our speakers had arrived, and simply the quality of the speakers was absolutely top. And I'd say the quality of the audience as well. Regretfully, we didn't have as much time for Q&A as we wanted to, but we had a very seriously keyed in audience who are really contributing to the knowledge exchange on the day. Running through the speeches, the talks we had on the day, I nervously began proceedings by introducing the day, and then I gave a very, very potted history of heroin use in the United Kingdom. So potted, in fact, what started off as 12,000 words of notes, which were supposed to be the introduction for another proposed book, which is not quite reaching the stage of having a publisher yet. And I managed to condense that 12,000 word notes into 10 minutes of speech. So it was all very, very condensed, and I'm sure I gave it very little justice. But as are the limitations of speaking with a time limit, that had to be done. Following from that, we had Katie Holloway. Again, you've heard about her a few times, my former PhD supervisor, and her a good friend and colleague, Elwyn Thomas, talking about their evaluation of Buvidal. Buvidal is an opiate agonist, I believe, but it's slow release and it's injectable. So how this particular drug treatment works is it's for people who are ready to stop using heroin or other opiates. They're injected once a month with Buvidal, and it essentially reduces cravings and anecdotally and from the research that already exists, it seems to be highly effective. And certainly I haven't specifically researched Buvidal, but when I've talked to people who are on Buvidal prescriptions, they speak very, very highly of it. So anyway, that was the first talk. We had Judith Yates, who is a very good friend of both street drugs discussions and drug science. She talked about what is in street heroin and talked about essentially what is found out in toxicology reports following tragic deaths of people who have used opiate drugs, talking about the results when street samples are sent to services such as Wedinos to find out what drugs are actually in samples of street drugs. So she talked about essentially growing threats relating to the Taliban ban on opium poppy production and what is expected to be a heroin drought expecting to arrive anytime soon, and talked about that in the context of nitazines, which are particularly very strong opiate drugs which can be found in illicit opiates and have been attributed to some tragic overdose deaths. We also then heard from Professor Adam Winstock talking about diamorphine-assisted treatment and a return to the British system of regulated, opiate control. We had Professor Alex Stevens talking about drug consumption rooms. And we had Neill Eastwood, of course, who was talking in a more, I think, holistic way about drug policy trends and challenges relating to heroin use. Anyway, hugely enjoyable day, hugely successful, and we did resolve to do something similar again at some point during 2025.
So I would say to listeners, watch this space because we will be doing more live events.
Yep, exactly. So yes, really enjoyed that day. Really want to do some sort of a repeat in the future.
Yeah, of course, James, worked tirelessly to organise this event, and it is a lot of work.
It is, especially when you didn't have a computer working until about half hour before everything went.
Yes, there is that.
That is also true. We should give a very special shout out to John Lucken, who works in IT and audio visuals at London Metropolitan University. So yeah, we had challenges. Oh, thanks for your hat tip to my hard work there. I'll say not nearly as hard as the work was for the first event.
Oh, my
really,
word.
as well as that was more ambitious. I think when you learn the ropes of organising an event in general and a particular institution, you learn, and it's never as hard as the first one.
We're kind of coming to the end. Is there anything else you would like to tell the audience?
Just as well, we had another recent street drugs event as the second one we've had in Wales, which is the second event we've had collaborating with Barod. This one was actually very different to the other events we've had in that there's a really specific focus on nighttime economy. Again, it was University of South Wales, Barod, and us at Street Drugs putting our heads together and had an event based in Cardiff. It was actually with the nighttime economy theme. It was at a music venue called the Tram Shed. So that had full kind of the lighting and sound befitting a nighttime economy venue. That was all very impressively put together and had a great load of talks largely about nighttime economy safety relating to substance use. We had a man who'd been working at security in Cardiff's nighttime venues for much of the last 20 years. We had another good friend of Street Drugs, Josh Torrance, who's appeared on at least one webinar. And he talked about his work with Rave Aid crew, who essentially turn up to illegal raves and run harm reductions. Essentially turning up in a pickup truck with a bell tent, lots of bottles of water, essentially lots of harm reduction advice for the revellers there. We heard from PsyCare, an organisation who provide harm reduction and welfare services at festivals, and are also now being contracted by local authorities to provide harm reduction in nighttime
That's
economy.
good. That's really
From
good.
PsyCare, really, both Rave Aid Crew and PsyCare, really impressive organisations. But anyway, that may have actually been the most recent. It was a very hectic 2 weeks. I think this was 1 week after our heroin event, so a very hectic couple of weeks in the street drugs calendars. But I think there will be more collaborations with Barod and our colleagues in Wales. And as mentioned, we will do more live events in London coming up and more webinars. There's one thing to add, which we always like to say is, as I've said, we are, or perhaps myself, I am a sucker for punishment, and I'm always up for starting new things. So if you're listening to this and you would like to have a street drugs event in your local area, then do drop us a message. There's a contact form on the Street Drugs webpage within the Drug Science website. But you could also, if you can email myself, James Morgan, Chris Chandler, Joe Neill, or message anyone to do with drug science or street drugs, let us know if you're interested in helping us to host an event in your local area. Because if you feel like you're underserved, if you feel that there are lots of people in your local area who are interested in drug-related issues, then we would love to host such an event and bring street drugs to your local area. And actually something else I will add as well as a reflection on the street drugs discussions, live events and webinars in general is, I guess what I like most about them is they bring research to people who work directly with people who use drugs or are people who use drugs themselves, or essentially share time and space with people who use drugs. Myself, Joe and Chris, we are all academics. We conduct research, we write journal articles, and we hope people read them. Ideally, lots of people within academia do read them, although sometimes you worry that not even many people from there do. There can be concerns that even when your research does get lots of readers within academia, how effectively does the knowledge filter down to people professionally involved in substance use? How much does our research ever actually change anything? Well, when I introduce a webinar, I normally kill a bit of time to allow latecomers to come in. So I ask people in the audience, where have you come from and what do you do? So many of the audience are drugs workers, our teachers, our police officers, our doctors, our nurses, our social workers, and they will listen to academic researchers, experts by experience, experts by professional experience. They will hear their lessons and they will enrich their own professional practice or their own, I suppose, social and relational skills and activities based on expert advice. So that's what we want to happen. That's what we want to spread around.
Can we also suggest that people could email with suggestions for webinars?
Yeah, topics.
Topic.
I love that. I think that's a brilliant. I was thinking that. So any of our listeners, you would like a topic, a particular drug or aspect of policy or anything covered that you really want to hear from the experts, we will find those experts and we'll put them on the webinar.
Yep, absolutely echo that. We have our regular meetings where we brainstorm ideas, but we want more ideas of what you believe has not been covered enough. Anything you'd like to know more of. Indeed, if you suggest an idea, we will find experts. But if you think there's an expert who has not been sufficiently platformed and you want to hear more from, drop us a line. We will contact them, and hopefully they will want to share their expertise, knowledge, experience, and skills with all of you listening at home.
And we are keen to have people with lived experience on the webinars. And I do think, James, you mentioned it. It is time street drugs got back on the road, really. So we would love to do more regional events. So do let us know where you'd like to see us.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, I think on that happy note, then, we will call it an evening. So I'd like to thank you both so much for coming on the podcast. The whole collaboration of street drugs is such fun. We do have a great time. We learn a lot. It's just been, a real privilege for me to be involved with this. So thank you both so much for doing this.
Thank you. And I'd like to add as well, one of the great things, it allows us to work together and it allows us to work with lots of very fun and interesting people, some of which might have even been our heroes we wanted to meet and do get to engage with through street drugs discussions.
Absolutely. And long may it continue.